turn it on because it's half Dhamma.
Yes, I see.
Okay, Alex.
Hello, Dhammarato.
It doesn't look like that it started yet. I see the stop recording, but it's still sitting at 0.
Ooh,
So I don't
interesting.
see it moving. Do you have the
Mine shows
counter?
it shows Dhammarato is recording the call, but it does not show a counter.
Okay. All right. I don't know whether to start with it like this or not.
Right.
If you don't mind, never mind. It's not important.
Okay.
We need to edit the first part of this to take that out. So if we're already
Oh,
recording, so I'm going to go ahead and start.
got it.
In any case, you're asking a question about the 4 foundations of mindfulness called the satipattana.
Yes.
Here, the word sati is
Mm.
translated into mindfulness, and I'm not sure that that's even anywhere near the best word to use, but I haven't come up with one. And so using sati as sati in the Pali and explaining it and what it means. But first, let's look at the 4 foundations, because the 4 foundations were the original physics of the time of the
Mm.
Buddha. That
Mm-hmm.
now we have 92 elements and counting, depending upon what CERN can do. But that in the time of the Buddha, there were only 4 elements.
Yes.
Okay, and that the elements, it seems that the way that it's structured has to do with how hot something is. For instance, water is solid when it's cold enough.
Right.
Water then is a liquid when it is the temperature that we have, that is somewhere between, on Celsius scale, 0 to 100 is when water
Okay.
is liquid.
Right.
And then after it gets to 100 degrees, then it becomes a vapor that we call steam specifically.
Right.
And then as you get something extraordinarily hot, then the water itself will break down into molecules. And if it gets even hotter than that, then the molecules themselves will break down into what is called a plasma.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, back to the original. The people could see that. They could see that the earth and trees and things were solid, and that there was liquid, there was water, there was rain, there was blood that would spill, etc., like
Mm-hmm.
that. And then there was some strange thing called fire that would
Mm-hmm.
consume, and that it put off a byproduct of smoke.
Mm-hmm.
And even if without the fire, the smoke is still in the air.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so these 4 things then were the 4 original elements in very primitive times. And the Buddha recognized the most important point that I'm talking about is that the Buddha recognized that the problem of the spiritual life and the spiritual practice was not to meditate upon these 4 elements that existed both internally and externally, but primarily the
Mm-hmm.
meditations were on the external, but that he taught to do this on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
So that in the old time they would have kasina meditations for the earth. They would have water meditations, and which now have become crystal meditations, and that they have
Mm-hmm.
in, let us say, in the new agey stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we've always known about fire meditations. In fact, Western groups have had retreats on fire meditations.
Yeah.
And that then there are sky meditations that we can
Yeah.
see solid evidence of. That in fact we can see 3 major groups coming from air meditations. One would be astronomy,
Yeah.
another because they're looking up in the skies at night. The other
Right.
one is it.
In almost in
Go
the
ahead.
state of samadhi.
Absolutely, that's what they
Yeah.
would do at night
Right.
instead of
Oh,
watching
that's wonderful.
the television soap operas,
Right.
they'd watch the sky soap operas. Actually, they
Yeah.
would watch the sky. When they
Right.
started seeing the sky as a soap opera at night, that's where we get
Yeah.
astrology.
Yeah. How cool.
Astro- okay, so astronomy is like taking the television apart and seeing why it
Right.
works the way that it do, and astrology is watching
Yeah.
the movies,
Yep. Telling a bunch of
making
stories
up the
about it. That's
stories.
cool.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool.
And then the third one, which is more recent, would be a meteorology, or the
Yeah.
study of the weather,
Right. Yeah.
because the
Because that's finding
meteorology
patterns.
and the meteorology was there in the first place. And in fact, the
Yeah.
meteorology kind of became the word God for us. Now, here's where that comes from: is
Okay.
because you know that the teaching of the Buddha has to do with anatta, or not atta.
Yes.
Well, the
Right.
word atom also, in fact, it comes from um, the Indo-European language, and in Greek, it's called uh, uh, atmo,
Atmos. Yeah.
which we get for our atmosphere.
Yeah.
Okay, and the original idea was is that the air around us was alive, that God is in the air, and
Yeah.
that at night there's
Spirit.
no end to it. The sphere
Mm.
of all of the stars and the sphere of the air seem to be alive.
Yeah.
Clouds move, weather comes. You know that the old understandings of God, that He threw lightning bolts, and He did the
Right.
thunder when He was unhappy, and He cried with
Rains.
rain, and all of
Yeah.
this kind of stuff. And that the Buddha taught that there is no real um, entity or God or personality, that the
Yeah.
air or the atmosphere has no personality, it just
Right.
has functions.
Just does what it does.
Okay? And
Yeah.
so when the Buddha took this into the internal foundations, he's using the same thing. It's the old physics, but what he's talking about is that the person, the human being with the human body, when he is alive, he has fire. When he
Yeah.
has fire, he has movement or fluidity. And when he has fire and fluidity, he also has a byproduct called the Dhammanupassana, or we can think of them as thoughts, or we can think of them as the way that things are moving and changing. Okay, and we
Mm.
can do that because this is a very interesting way of the distinction between the way that it's described in the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, Sutta number 10, and the way it's defined in the Anapanasati Sutta. That
Yeah.
we have to take all of that together in the two suttas because it's looking at it from two frames of reference.
Okay.
But everything, the foundations or the physics is both true on the inside and on the outside, but all the spiritual life that the meditators, and even he with the four jhanas and the kasinas and all of those kind of meditations, didn't liberate us.
Mm.
That the austerities that he did weren't liberating, and the jhanas that he was doing were not liberating.
Mm-hmm.
And much of the reason for that was because all of the meditators were using external objects.
Mm.
And so what the Buddha decided was is that we need to focus
Oh.
on the internal reality, the internal
Right.
physics, the physics of the body itself, the feelings, the
How
mind,
mind's attention moves.
where the mind is actually the fire.
Uh,
The mind is fire. In fact,
right.
Ajahn Thanissaro has written a book, and the name of the book was Mind Like Fire Unbound.
Okay.
Okay, so what that means is that the mind is actually
Wow.
the fire. Now, one of the ways that I speak about it is imagine that you've got an old pot-bellied wood stove.
Okay.
Okay, the wood stove itself is the body. It's going to be there. It's physical.
Yes.
All right, and then the kindling and the wood are actually the
Oh,
feelings,
right.
and the fire itself is then the mind, the burning. That's the whole
Right.
point. And then you have the smoke that goes up the chimney. So there's your four foundations right there in the stove. And the kind of wood that we put in the stove determines the kind
Yes.
of fire that we're going to have. That in fact, the Buddha uses this as an example
Wonderful.
of consciousness in the sense
Yeah.
that you have um, wood stoves, you have gas stoves, you have grass fires, wood
Right.
fires. Um, uh, Let us say wood that is not fit for burn because it's got mud on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's stinky
Yep.
if it's been in PCs or any of that kind of stuff. Okay,
Yep.
and also we could bring in the analogy of, well, how is the stove itself and the fire and the wood inside the stove, what kind of air vents does it
Yeah.
have?
Right.
That in,
How
okay, but
how well can it move it out?
mhm, the
Yeah.
airflow, which is the atmos.
Yeah.
Okay, the
Right.
spirit is in the air. You cannot have
Yeah.
a good fire without the air, just like you cannot
Right.
have a good human being without it breathing.
Right.
So you can see
Wow.
all of these analogies. All this history
Yeah.
actually helps make sense as to why we're doing these four foundations of mindfulness, is because that's our reality, the whole
Yes.
sum of it.
And this is what I was thinking when I was thinking on the word mindfulness and the word discernment. Because sati, if it's used like discernment, what we're doing is we're discerning the wood quality. We're discerning
Precisely.
how roaring the fire is based off of whether or not we're oxygenating it well enough. We're
Hmm.
discerning what posture the wood stove is in. Because if it's over on its side, we need to stand it up before we put the wood inside. So we
You're
discern
getting
all of these. Yeah.
you're getting that. You're understanding it, right? Okay, so this
Yeah.
is why a
Okay.
wood stove
Good.
is a really good analogy for it.
Yeah. I like
Unfortunately, in
that
the
a
time
lot.
they didn't have cast iron wood stoves, so the Buddha didn't use that analogy, but we can because we understand it. Okay, but he had
Yeah.
similar things, um,
Right.
and so we talk about, in the sense of the mind, we talk about consciousness. Then
Yeah.
is determined by the kind of fuel.
Right. Because those are like our sankara,
Exactly. You're
our
making
wood.
my points for me.
Yes. Oh, that's so amazing. Because that's how it works in Paticca Samuppada as well. Yes, these mental formations that we have, or we talked before. We used the word determination,
Hmm.
or even I also like the word activities, but I don't know if I like it as much as determinations.
Well,
But it's
that in
also
fact our
very
determinations bring rise then to our activity.
yeah, yeah. And the
But
act of determining is it's active. I feel like sometimes like
well,
we
it
engage in
actually is.
perception. Yeah.
The the Buddha, there's a sutta where the Buddha is comparing what his teaching is to the way that the Brahmins taught.
Okay.
Now, the way that the Brahmins taught is actually the way that our legal systems, old British common law, etc., was
Okay.
built upon this, in the sense that if you do something to hurt someone, then you've done something, and that's a big act, and you could go to jail or in prison or in the stocks or flogging or
Mhm.
death because of your actions. Okay, and then the next one, the level below that, is speech. And that normally white collar crime has to do with papers and documents and speech and information.
Yep.
right? But we actually are having a whole lot of trouble in our legal system making thought. Okay, so
Yeah.
that's one of the things that they're doing is what was Donald Trump's intention, what was in his
Right.
mind. And
Right.
so, in this regard, the Brahmins would say that an action is like carving something in stone. It's going to
Hmm.
be there, to where our vocal is very much like writing it down on a piece of paper that's kind of temporary.
Yeah.
Okay. And then our thoughts are like writing in the air or writing in water.
Mm.
And it's so
Okay.
fluid that our thoughts just move away. Okay. You can write your name or you can write an entire constitution in the air and it's gone before you get it finished writing.
Right.
Oh, okay. So this is the
Mm.
way that the Brahmins thought was is that there is nothing to the mind. There is
Okay.
very little to the speech, that the actions are the big deal.
Mm.
Okay. And our common law is based upon that.
Yeah. Right.
All right.
Okay.
So the Buddha turns that upside down.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, oh no, monks, the mind is the forerunner. You
Always.
cannot
Right.
have a speech unless you've thought it out.
Uh,
You cannot even talk to me and use English language sentences unless you're thinking
yeah.
about what you're speaking.
Right.
Now, a lot of the speech that we have is sort of like stored stuff. Is kind of like a quick cut and paste rather than having to rethink it out or retype it out.
Right. Right.
Okay? And this is really dangerous to use our own cut and paste system because we're often cutting and pasting into something that doesn't fit reality, but we
Different
use the cut.
context.
Mm-hmm. A
Yeah.
word like that, an example would be when we're in pain, we say ouch or oh or make some sort of noise.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, in that regard, just taking it onto the side here, going down the rabbit hole, that if you are being tortured,
Yeah.
the torturers want to see results of their torture.
Right.
And the guys who are stoic in the sense that they won't say anything when they're being tortured get tortured a whole lot more. But
Yes.
if you're screaming like a banshee every time they touch you, they get annoyed with it, but they don't hurt you nearly so much because
Mm-hmm.
they think that they're hurting you because you're screaming about it.
yes.
All right, but all of this is
Mm-hmm.
just those stored things that are
Yeah.
stored and they're triggered. Okay,
Yeah.
like what would you say if you stump your toe in the dark?
Ow.
Ow, exactly. All right, where does
Mm-hmm.
that ow come from?
Just been there.
It's been there because the first
Mm-hmm.
ow that you said when you were a child. In fact,
Yeah, when
that
I was one
ow
and a half
is
or
the
something.
first thing that the human being says upon getting slapped in the butt by the doctor.
Yep.
I
yep.
don't know that they have changed that, but back in the 1940s, that's exactly
Mm-hmm.
what to do. I remember it well. There I was sitting in my hot tub. Everything was taken care of. I didn't even have to pick up my drinks. And all of a sudden, an earthquake happened. The bottom dropped out, and the next thing I know, Dr. Young is holding me up by the heels, beating my ass. Well, I let out a yell so loud I didn't stop yelling until I was about 35 years old.
Good. I don't blame you. I'm still 35 years old.
That's when I
That's
arrived at
great.
that's when I arrived at Swatsu and Moke.
Oh, I love it. That's amazing.
All right, so that yelling that we do
right.
is inbred.
Yeah. Right. Yeah,
It's
we have these we're
part of the
predisposed to it.
DNA. Right. And
Yes.
and a whole
Right.
lot of the language that we use is that way. It is
Right.
automatic that it comes out. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like a dad telling the kids to shut up. when they are
Yes.
making noise. That's an automatic response that he has to the feelings that he has if he doesn't like the kids making noise.
Right.
And in
That
fact, he may be
feeling,
watching
automatic
television and
response to feelings.
exactly. So let us give the
Yeah.
example that the dad's watching the movie or watching the news, and now the kid's making especially loud noise, and that's when he gets annoyed, and that's when he says "shut up," and he's not even aware that he's annoyed.
Yep. And he's right back into it. Boom. And he has
Boom.
no
Okay.
context.
Exactly.
He's lost
So
all his context. He's not aware of the currently persisting feeling. He's not aware of the mind already there in his experience or the body. He's not aware
so
of the Dhamma. He was caught off guard by it.
mhm. Now a
Mm.
lot of the students will say when they start meditation that what will happen is that they'll have a feeling and that they'll talk about that feeling as kind of original without recognizing that those feelings, every one of them, is triggered by the mind.
Yeah.
Every one of the
Yeah.
feelings that we have is triggered by the mind. The
It's
mind
so
is the
sneaky.
forerunner,
It is.
and that part of the process of the
Mm.
meditation is to start recognizing that feelings don't start things off, the mind starts things off.
Yes.
Okay, just as a reference, there the Pali words is kaya nupassana. You can see the
Hmm.
nupassana, the vipassana, or
Yeah.
the movement and the knowledge of the body, and then there
Hmm.
is Vedana nupassana, which is knowledge of the movements of the feelings, and then there is Sita nupassana, which is the mind, and then there's the
Dhamma.
Dhamma Vipassana, which is all of the events, all of the smoke that we put out, and the air that we fill in, and all of the movement, including the arising and falling, or the temporariness, the rotting away, the dying, and the relinquishment.
Yes.
All
Right.
of that is part of the Dhamma Vipassana. I'd like to back up though one little point about
Mm.
the Sita Vipassana. In the
Okay.
Pali, there are two different words for it.
Huh?
And the two different words are like Manu and
Manu
Sita.
and Cheetah.
Sita.
Yeah. And Manu is, what is it? It's different. I don't see it used as
It's the
often.
higher part of the mind. In fact, you could say that the
Ah,
Manu is what makes us a man or a human.
okay.
Okay, the
Okay.
Manu, the higher part.
I see.
And then the Sita is actually the lower part of the mind
Oh. And
that
is that
we
why
would
sometimes you see it translated as heart mind?
exactly. That's in fact what we're talking about. That in English
Ah.
language, we have the distinction between following your mind and following your heart.
Yes.
And the
Right.
Christians give the worst possible advice to follow your heart, when in fact it is the heart that's the problem.
Yes, it traps the mind.
Okay, that in fact the higher part of the mind doesn't need so much training. But the Sita, which would be also called the reptilian brain or the lower
Yeah.
part of the mind, is where the feelings originate. Even though the feelings are often experienced in the body,
Right.
and the sense of
They all.
anxiety is because of adrenaline in the system, and all of
Yes.
that kind of thing. Okay, and so the feelings are somewhere between, and the education or the messaging system for the body.
Right. Right.
And so um, we can then see that we can make some changes to the way that
Yes.
we feel, but not directly to the feelings, but rather we're going to make the changes to the
Right.
feeling through the mind, because the mind is the
Right.
forerunner. Okay. So if the
Very much
student
so.
is sitting there in
We're.
meditation and recognizing that he has anxiety and is wondering where it came from the unwholesome thoughts that he was having before he
Yes.
experienced the anxiety.
Yes.
And
Right.
that if we can change our thought systems from unwholesome to wholesome thoughts, then
Right.
we can change the feelings that we have from unwholesome feelings to wholesome feelings.
Hmm.
Or we can also talk about it in the sense of bad feelings versus good feelings. Now, basically, bad feelings and good feelings are the distinction between I like it and I don't like it.
Right. Okay.
All right. So,
See that.
the kind of feelings that we can have when we don't like it would be fear, anxiety, anger, grief,
Mm-hmm.
remorse, all those kind of feelings that we have that are downers.
Right.
But if it's pleasant, then we can go into those feelings that are talked about in the sukha, which would be
Mm-hmm.
feelings of safe, feelings of secure, feelings of comfort, feelings of satisfaction. So
Mm-hmm.
feelings of ill will or not liking things is actually a kind of dissatisfaction. That's the
Yes.
dukkha.
Yes. Very much
So
so.
what we can then begin to practice is that if we can change the mind, we can change the way that we feel because the
Mm-hmm.
mind is the forerunner.
Yes.
And a lot of students have trouble figuring this out because they're so slow that they can only see how they feel. They can't see
Right.
how
They
what
don't
triggered
see
that or how they talk
mind's
themselves
attention.
into it.
Right. And this is one of the reasons that we must have, oh, I'm going to butcher the Pali, Uniso Maniscaro.
I'm not sure. You must have killed it.
We must have, I did, it's bad, but it's, how can we say it in English? Mindfulness with clear comprehension,
Mhm.
or attention rooted in reality.
Okay.
Attention rooted in context.
All
If that
right.
makes sense. So many
Yes.
caro.
Yes, it does make sense that way
Okay.
because almost all of our bad feelings are built in.
Yes.
Their
Right.
DNA, or another way of talking about it, it is instinctual.
Yes.
That
And when
if
we
you
don't
like,
recognize that they arise first, meaning I don't control them directly, there's no button I can push, there's no knob I can turn directly. When I don't realize that, then I pick them up. I identify with them,
mm-hmm,
and I start to think that they're me, mine, that they belong to somebody, that they can even be owned. That's what I was
oh,
trying to say when I talked about if the body is first, my sense of self is not mine. Because I recognize it's all just already there in the situation, enduring as a basis for everything else that's taking place. Same with,
okay.
uh,
Actually, that may be true only when we're slow. Remember
yeah,
back when we
okay.
were saying that the mind is the forerunner.
Yes, right, yes. Because mind,
Okay.
it all is in mind. Everything is in
All
mind.
right. So think about a steam locomotive. That
Okay.
locomotive is not going to move. It's not going to blow its whistle. It's not going to do anything until it's got fire.
Yes.
And when the fire operates, it operates by
Ah,
making
I see.
steam the
Yes.
feelings, and the feelings
Right.
drive the pistons of the
Drive me.
locomotive.
And that's why there's the pursuit, the reward, and the escape.
Not sure about that. You're
I heard
talking
it said
about the
in this
time sequence,
way.
but that doesn't fit with the steam engine because
Oh,
the
oh,
steam
what I
engine
was saying
has.
was we have a feeling, it causes a pursuit of some sort that then
Mm-hmm.
rewards us, that makes us
Right.
feel okay with listening to the need to move in the future. Whereas
Okay.
that's the conditioning, conditioning the
Well,
formations to have the same response in the future. Whereas if we see the
okay.
danger in pursuit, then we know we don't have to. The reward is not worth it.
All
The
right.
reward is the
So
trap.
back to the steam engine then, the
Yeah.
natural thing would be that we sometimes the steam engine is on the wrong track.
Yes. Right. Yes.
It's
Yes.
heading for danger.
Yes.
and that we need to bring it to a stop.
Mm.
And the most
Ah, right,
natural
right.
way, okay, so here's the big thing. Let's take it from, in fact, a steam engine or a locomotive into a ship, because a ship has no brakes.
Right. Right. And it's a very good
All,
example because it's like the mind in that if you point it in one direction, since it has no brakes, it needs to burn off the energy in order to go back the other way. So if we get really wholesome,
yes,
it doesn't
exactly. And if we,
automatically become ruined at the
mhm,
first instant because we have composure, because we're established in the wholesome through
all
discernment.
right.
So
Well,
I like that ship. That
the
makes
way,
sense in my head.
well, the point is that you're a whole lot further ahead of me in the story.
Oh,
But I'm talking about how
sorry.
things get started, and you're talking about how to
Yes.
bring it to an end. And we're
Oh,
still looking at how things operate.
I'm sorry. I get excited.
Okay. That
I'll have to slow myself down.
okay. So in that regard, then the mind is the forerunner of the paticca samuppada that gives rise to the feelings of liking and not liking. And if those
Yes.
feelings are ignorant, it leads to actions like wanting, craving,
Oh,
doing something to get something. And our, in this regard, our steam engine winds up hitting a brick wall or going off a cliff because it's on the
right.
wrong track.
Right. Because it
So,
doesn't recognize that it can't actually do it that way.
so
It
what
needs to go
we're
another
talking
way.
about is then we need to slowly take, because of the way that the mind operates, to slowly start taking the fire out of the boiler,
Right.
out of the firebox. We have to take the
Right.
water or take the fire out so that the water, our feelings, is not so hot, which
Yes.
means that now the water is not hot enough to push the pistons, and the steam engine begins to slow down and stop.
Yes.
That
Right.
in fact, you know
Oh,
that on an old steam engine, they had two operators. They had the
right.
pilot or the engineer, and
And
then
the
they
shovel
had the
man.
fireman.
Uh-huh.
And
Yep.
and what's the fireman's job? Is to keep shoveling coal or wood
Yep.
into the firebox. Because if
Right.
you don't keep putting fire in there, that steam engine is going to slow right down and stop. So something
Yep.
inside of us has a fireman that keeps pushing and keeps putting the fuel into the
Right.
mine.
Right.
Okay. So back to the boiler. Now we've, excuse me, back to from the pot-bellied stove that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've got that pot-bellied stove on tracks, and it's become a locomotive.
Okay.
All right. So
Got it.
not only is the byproduct steam from the steam, the byproduct from the steam is also from the fire, the smoke. It's also the motion,
Yes,
the
that too.
movement.
Yeah.
Okay. So the air that's around us is constantly in motion.
Yes.
That smoke doesn't just sit there; it's
Mm.
in movement.
Yes.
Especially if you're thinking about a locomotive, the smoke goes up into the air and the engine is moving right along. So there's a trail of smoke on top of
Yep.
the smoke is staying more or less kind of where it was, but it looks like that there's a trail of smoke because the engine itself that's putting out the smoke is moving.
Right.
This is a good analogy then for the way that the human behaves, is that we
Yes.
have we have fire in the belly, and that fire is not a feeling. The feeling is the
Mhm.
result of the fire in the belly, or the fire that's actually in the mind.
Right.
So the way that we practice is to stop putting that kind of fuel into the fire.
Right.
Stop putting those kind of thoughts in the mind.
Yes.
And we need to practice this, because we're the firemen that is such a bad habit of just shoveling coal and shoveling coal and
Yeah.
shoveling coal out of a bad habit. We need to start figuring out when is the right time to put coal in, and when is the
Right.
time to stop putting that coal in and start putting something better in.
Because one of the habits I see from the fireman so far is he doesn't care what kind of fuel goes in. Like
Doesn't
when he
care.
first, he
He's
just
just
he says,
shoveling
just don't let it
whatever's
die.
there.
Yeah,
Exactly, just don't let it
and the
die. Just
mind
keep
is
it.
just fucking ripping through it. So I feel for the fireman. He's got a job to do, but wouldn't it be nice if he could just sit down for a second and be a little more selective? Because I see that analogy.
Exactly.
That's very good.
So this is where we begin then to practice our meditation is to tell
Yes,
the fireman to take a rest. Stop
right.
putting that fuel in,
Hmm.
because the mind is the forerunner for those feelings. And yet the students will, in fact, the common situation is that, oh, I need to meditate. I'm not sure why. I just don't really like my life and I
Right,
want it to be better.
right.
Now
And
they
it's kind of
sit
magical thinking.
with a lot of
You
magical
know,
thinking.
if I
And
sit
so
down
they
and I
do.
do this, then someone will come along and pop, I'm gonna get enlightened.
Exactly. And so
Yeah,
when they do sit down, all they see that's come is their anxiety,
yeah,
their
yeah.
fear, their dissatisfactions with life,
Right.
and they don't recognize that, oh, we need to have the firemen to stop putting that stuff in, to
Yes.
stop having the kind of thoughts that bring on the adrenaline that keeps the anxiety and the fear moving.
Hmm. Right. It's like the
But
man that's walking quickly.
but the
He finds
fireman
himself
is
walking quickly.
so the fireman, the human meditator that's sitting there,
Hmm.
when he out of our old habits, when he sees that the mind has wandered away, when he sees that he is shoveling coal, and
Ah,
recognized that for at one time he wasn't shoveling, but now all of a sudden he's shoveling. And the way that we would talk about it is in the Goenka sense is when the mind wanders away from the breath, never mind, start again.
right.
Okay, so that means then that the fireman was actually taking a rest. He was watching the breath,
Yes.
and to
Mm.
now the mind has wandered away from the breath means that now he started shoveling coal again. And when he wakes up to
Yep.
that, he starts shoveling coal even harder
Hmm.
with the kind of thoughts of, oh, I can't meditate. Oh, this is really hard. Oh, I wish I
Yep.
could have done it before. And all of these kind of really unwholesome shoveling jobs that we have. That what we need to do is instead remind ourselves that, hey, I caught myself shoveling coal again.
Yeah.
Let me rest. Let me stop
Right.
doing that. Let me
Yeah.
have lunch. Let me have something wholesome and stop putting all of this coal into the belly of the fire.
Hmm.
So this is the analogy that we can use then for the satipattana. This is it.
Okay.
This is that steam engine that we have. And if we would stop feeding the coal to it, then the fire would settle down. It wouldn't be so hot. And because of
Right.
the mind, the fire is not so hot. We don't generate so much steam from the our feelings are not steamy anymore. They're cool.
They are cooling. They may even
And
quench.
because and exactly, and because
Hmm.
of the quenching of that steam, the cooling off of the water, the steam engine comes to a rest. It stops. And so, having the kind of thoughts of no place to go and nothing to do, and the spring comes and the grass grows by itself, and I've got no worries, no place to go, we start talking to ourselves. The engineer, in fact, is giving the fireman orders to stop
Yeah.
feeding the coal, to stop having things to do, to stop looking for activities, to stop thinking that we're going to solve a problem by moving the steam engine down the track. That the steam
Perfect.
engine will
And
be a
that's
whole
what I
lot
was
better
talking
off.
about. Yeah.
Yeah, if it would slow down and
Yeah.
sometimes even come to a stop.
Right. Just let it be.
So that's the way to talk about it, the
I like that.
Satipatthana.
Yes. The steam engine, the pot bellied stove. the ship.
And stop feeding the fuel. Or
Yes.
the
Right.
first thing, in fact, to the going back to the analogy of the pot-bellied stove, or let us say the fireman, that when he refuels,
Yes.
which means that he fills back up the coal car,
Right.
or he fills up the wood car again, let's make sure that he's getting good fuel. So
Yes.
this is the
So,
beginning. We could, if we were very sharp as practitioners, look at every shovel of coal, every thought.
right. Right.
But most meditators are not sharp enough. So what we're going to do instead is saying every time you refuel, we're going to get wholesome fuel, not unwholesome fuel.
Right.
We're going
And
to
this is
start
good.
having.
This takes out some of the work, because if we can watch the mind, the behavior is going to behave itself.
Mhm. So there's
Yeah.
two jobs of the fireman. The first job of the fireman is to start using good fuel.
Mm-hmm.
Start having happy thoughts. Start having
Mm-hmm.
easygoing thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Stop putting, let us say, mossy, dirty, muddy fuel in. Or
Right.
in case of a coal car, we want very, very strong, I think it's called anthracite, that
Mm-hmm.
we don't want to put bituminous, and we certainly don't want to put peat in there, because
Right.
peat doesn't give much heat and it puts a lot of smoke out.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's various kinds of coal. So in that regard, we need to choose what kind of coal we're putting in, or what kind of wood, what kind of fuel we're putting into the fire.
Right.
And then we recognize that every moment we have a choice. Are we going to have wholesome thoughts or unwholesome thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
And now, eventually, if we can really get it to the point that we know we can control it, so that we have one wholesome thought after another wholesome thought after another wholesome thought, we can begin to put some gaps
Yeah.
between those
Right.
wholesome thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that the fireman has to learn to do is to start, instead of shoveling poor coal or poor quality thoughts, now we're going to
Mm-hmm.
start shoveling high quality thoughts. And then after that, we're going to start not shoveling so many wholesome logs.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to
Right.
start shoveling fewer logs. We're going to put some gaps between these wholesome logs.
Mm-hmm.
If we put gaps between unwholesome logs, then we're still going to have a lot of stinky, stinky.
Right.
So we want to have high quality. That's the first thing that we learn to do, is
Mm-hmm.
start putting high quality wood in, or high quality
Yes.
coal. And then the next
Mm-hmm.
thing that we learn to do is to put some gaps between those logs that we're shoveling in, not putting
Mm-hmm.
so many shovels of coal in, to take a break, let the
Right.
thing cool off. So the first thing that we're going to do is to stop having such a stinky mess, and then eventually we're going to have even less, and so now we're actually beginning to put the fire out.
Yes. Right.
So that's a way of practicing. That would be then the way of saying it like this. You've heard good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in
Mm-hmm.
the end. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so the good in the beginning means we're starting to put really good, high quality fuel in.
Mm-hmm.
Good in the middle means we're not putting so much fuel in, we're putting some
Right.
gaps in there. And then
See?
good in the end means we've run out of fuel.
Quenched. Done.
We've quenched it out. We've let it go cold.
Yep. Happy as can
Okay.
be.
So the first part of it is that we've got a really, really stinky bad fire. We're getting some
Mm-hmm.
progress, but oh, what cost it is. I mean, we've got a really,
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
dirty environment. We've got all kinds of pollution. We've got stinky smoke coming out. Um, but when we practice in the beginning, we can begin to clear the air, begin to see
Yes.
things a lot better,
Right.
have a cleaner environment. But
Mm-hmm.
then we begin to say, oh, well, if that's the case, I can even clean the place up even more by stop shoveling so much coal. Good in the
Yep.
middle means we're not putting so much effort into it. We're just sitting there and relaxing.
Mm.
And the third part then is that, hey, wait a minute, I don't have to put coal in this thing. Let's just let it coast for a
Yep.
while. Maybe we can let it coast for the rest of our lives.
Let's just see what it does.
And let it slowly come to an easy, happy stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, when
And
I'm
it's
talking to students, I have to keep track of where they are in this so that we can talk about it in the sense of, well, are we going to have merely just wholesome thoughts? Or are we going to put some gaps in those thoughts? That in fact you could say then that the first jhana is that we're very selective at what kind of fuel we're putting in. We're not putting in muddy logs anymore. We're not putting in peat anymore. We're putting only really high quality fuel into the mind.
right.
Okay, and then the second jhana would be that we're beginning to not put so much coal in, that we're putting some gaps in there.
And that's why Vitaka and Vichara leave.
And then the later
Okay.
part of it would be then is that we've kind of run out of fuel. That's
Yeah.
the hard. It's just be that carrying fuel to burn.
Right.
So there's your satipattana. You've got the locomotive itself. You've got the steam for the water storage, and you've got the wood that burns. And
Yep.
the wood that burns is actually the feelings. The wood itself is the feelings that we have,
Yes.
as
Right.
well as the steam that's produced. And then the steam, the feelings, move the locomotive. So that's a good
I dig it.
analogy for the four foundations of mindfulness.
It is. I really like it. It's really helpful. I'm gonna remember it. I can dig it. Oh man.
All
And
right.
when we look at it in that way and we see that in that way, it helps to arouse dispassion, helps to arouse renunciation, helps to arouse I guess renunciation is kind of like that last step of anapanasati,
Mm-hmm.
throwing back. Is that the same idea?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's amazing. I love that.
All right. So let's bring this call to a close,
Yes, sir. It sounds good.
and
I
then
have to do the barbecue.
I'll call you and we'll talk about uh, the stuff on the website. We'll put some
Sounds
wholesome wood
good to
on
me.
that one. All right. So
Mm-hmm.
we'll see you later.
All right, then. See you in a little while, man. Take care, Dhammaratog.